Welcome everyone to the final event of the fall semester for the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, where tonight we have the opportunity to learn with Avidan Cover and USF faculty, law school faculty member Rhonda McGee during our third annual Human Rights Lecture, Oscar Grant, Tamir Rice, and the Victims We Don't Know, Legal Murder of People of Color and Immunity for Police. Tonight's event, in keeping with a small ritual started a couple weeks ago, tonight's event is being held on the historical lands, let's see if I can do two things at once, there we go, of the Ohlone people. In lighting these herbs, thanks Mark, in lighting these herbs given to me earlier this semester by USF by local Native American leader Karina Gold, I wish to acknowledge the Ohlone as traditional custodians and stewards of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Founded in 2008, the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice is the first and only program in the history of the United States formally linking Jewish studies with social justice. In addition to offering numerous courses related to this interdisciplinary field, our program offers a minor in JSSJ, as well as a number of annual events, including a speaker series, an annual human rights lecture, annual social justice lecture, and an annual social justice Passover Seder. This event is our fourth event of the fall. Our fifth event, which opened back in September and will continue through December, is an art installation located in the atrium of Kalmanovitz Hall called Jews of Color in Color. Shattering the stereotype of the white Ashkenazi Jew, this powerful photo exhibit, composed by Scattered Among the Nations, presents Jewish communities from around the world, countries such as Ghana, India, Mexico, and Zimbabwe. If you're interested in being put on our JSSJ listserv, there's a form over at the table in the front of the room, or I guess the back room. Thank you for tonight's performance also goes to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Now to begin tonight's program officially. You guys can come on in. There's tons of seats. Everyone doesn't have to look. Don't look when you guys come in. Okay. The most valued text in the Jewish tradition is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Among the many biblical directives of you shall do this, you shall not do that, we find the verse, you shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. According to the rabbis of the Talmud, a set of sacred books almost as important in Jewish tradition as the Torah itself, this verse appears 36 times in the Torah. By many accounts, this means that this commandment, appearing more than any other, is more important than any other. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. But who is the stranger? Being a stranger, feeling out of place, is for perhaps most of us a normal part of the human experience. But what about for those whom being a stranger is much more than a transient feeling? Those who live day in and day out in the midst of oppression? What about those who live in the margins, whether based on race, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, or another social identity category? What about those who cannot drive without fear of being pulled over by the police or even killed by the police? What about those who are unable to walk down the street without potentially being assaulted in a governmentally sanctioned action? Tonight's speaker lives and identifies with particular social identities as well as being a member of the larger human collective, an individual who fights for the so-called stranger. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Avidan Cover, a professor of law at Case Western Reserve University of Law and director of the Institute for Global Security, Law and Policy. Avi teaches in the Civil Rights and Human Rights Clinic in the Milton A. Kramer Law Clinic Center, where he supervises students representing clients in civil lawsuits, primarily in the areas of civil rights, including freedom of speech, unlawful force, housing discrimination, as well as documenting human rights abuses. He also teaches race and American law, constitutional law, and international humanitarian law. His scholarship focuses on human rights, civil rights, and national security law. He's appeared in numerous news media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, CNN, and on and on. Prior to his appointment at Case Western Reserve, he taught at Seton Hall University School of Law, where he supervised the Urban Revitalization Project in Newark, New Jersey. In addition, he was a Gibbons Public Interest and Constitutional Law Fellow, during which time he litigated prisoners' rights, same-sex marriage, and national security and education cases in federal and state court. He's also served as senior counsel in Human Rights First's Law Security Program, where he researched and analyzed U.S. military and intelligence agencies' interrogation and detention policies and practices, in particular in Guantanamo Bay. Holds a BA degree from Princeton University, a JD cum laude from Cornell School of Law. Before I say please join me in welcoming Avi, one note, immediately following Avi's remarks, we're going to have a conversation between Avi and USF Law School Professor Rhonda McGee, who I'll introduce at that point. Please join me in welcoming Avi.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to thank in particular the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, as well as the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and to Rhonda for, I know it will be a good and engaging conversation. We all know the names that ring out like a painful chorus of deaths at the hands of police officers. Michael Brown, Oscar Grant, Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Eric Garner. Many more names could be added to that list. Black men are 21 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. African Americans killed by police are twice as likely to be unarmed as whites. And the police are almost never criminally indicted, let alone convicted or found guilty of murder. We shouldn't know these names, these data, their facts and identities scarred into many of our brains. I wish I could say that they should be discarded or could be discarded, like old baseball players' names who I might remember, or music lyrics. But we can't forget these names, and we shouldn't. However, I believe that the focus on these tragic stories, these senseless deaths and deadly force statistics, obscures some of the roots of the real problem. Or at the very least, the final bullet shot or chokehold that took away a man or boy or girl or woman's life should not be the only focus. Because the problems and dangers are not about single, brief, violent interactions between police officers and suspects turned victims. We can pick apart with forensic detail the fatal skirmish between Michael Brown and Officer Darren Wilson. But the problems begin far earlier. They're far more widespread. They're systemic. We need to zoom out and see the larger picture. And from my perspective, particularly as a lawyer, as a law professor, I believe they're embedded in the law, in our legal system. The problems begin with the police's unbridled discretion to stop Michael Brown, to target Sam DuBose, to monitor Black Lives Matter activists, to stop Philando Castile, to ticket Eric Garner, to drive up onto Tamir Rice, to chase Melissa Williams, to shoot Alton Sterling, and so many more. And this is the law, and this is what the law sanctions. It forgets the Constitution's promises, forged only after slavery and the Civil War, for due process, for rights to life and liberty, and to equal protection. So here's how I think it works. It works in 4 pieces. First, charge the police with an aggressive mission of rooting out all crime or drugs or stopping violence, in which you view civilians as monsters or criminals. What we have more recently called, in the last few decades, broken windows policing. Start with the petty or minor offenses, and all will be well. No tolerance. Second, create a legal regime which allows almost unfettered discretion to carry out this mission. And this has 2 pieces. You allow the police to stop and seize individuals with virtually no basis of suspicion, and they can use force under a very deferential and discretionary standard. Third, create a legal regime which pardons all mistakes of police officers, and balancing the interest always favors the police. Police are not held to the same standard for violence as are you and me and everyday civilians. They're not held to a higher standard, they're held to a lower standard. And finally, no accountability. In addition to likely finding all police actions of force reasonable, even if they're not reasonable, we don't hold police responsible unless the actions are, and this is the court's words often, of the plainly incompetent. We bend over backwards to forgive and exonerate the police, leaving victims unprotected and uncompensated. To hold governments responsible, to hold police departments in cities, they must have an actual policy that essentially requires an unlawful use of force, a far higher standard than we apply to private companies and corporations. And these problems are self-perpetuating, reinforcing, and circular. Broken windows policing leads to more interactions and more abuses and more immunity. It takes on in our history other sorts of words too. You might think of the Black Codes, or the war on crime, or the war on drugs. It involves increasing criminalization, increasing incarceration, and a continuum of government-sponsored violence and excessive force occurs on a daily basis, most of which isn't reported. It's not captured on cell phone videos, and it doesn't make the headlines. It's not murder. It's these smaller violations of people's personal space, of their liberty, of their dignity. About 30 million people a year experience what is termed unwarranted or unwanted police encounters. 30 million. And what do you add to this broken windows aspect? Well, in some cases, it's a financial boom. The United States Department of Justice found that in Ferguson, this was a source of revenue, stopping people with aggressive policing. And of course, it has a racial element. Between the years 2012 to 14 in Ferguson, 97% of all arrests were of African Americans. Or in Cleveland, my hometown, where the federal government also found that there was a widespread practice and policy of unlawful excessive force. And amidst all the horrible data that this report documented, there was this one particular vignette or description that really haunted me. There was a sign that the report describes hanging in one of the police stations, and it read, characterized the police station as a forward operating base. This is a term for a military outpost in Afghanistan or Pakistan or the various other places where the United States military rages. But it's an outpost that should support tactical operations in a foreign war zone. And it sends the message to the people of Cleveland that the police are military occupiers instead of public servants and the community's protectors. Or broken windows can take the form of a cavalier and even encouraging view toward violence of a certain president, who said in the summer, speaking to police in New York, when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over, like don't hit their head, and they just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, this is the president, I said, you can take the hand away, okay? That's the broken windows component. You add to this an unbridled discretion. This comes in, and was something over the election a year ago that got a lot of attention, was often known as stop and frisk. Right? The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But in reality, the way the court has interpreted, particularly over the last 50 years, it places very few limitations on an officer's discretion to stop and arrest a person. In most cities, blacks are far more likely to be stopped by police than whites. In Boston, they're 3 times as likely. In Chicago, 8 times as likely. New York City has infamously operated a stop and frisk program that received a lot of attention. There, in 2012, of the 700,000 people stopped, 85% were young black or Latino men. And what about the results? Was it effective? Right, which is often the dispute. Well, in almost 90% of those stops, people were released with no evidence of wrongdoing found. The number of stops of black men in New York City who were stopped exceeded the number of black men in the United States. In New York City. Astounding. So how does this happen? How does the United States Supreme Court fashion this sort of law and structure? Back in 1968, there was more and more of a perception of increasing violence and need for law and order as the rhetoric of the day held. The court held in Terry versus Ohio that police could stop people even when they didn't have what's known as probable cause of criminal activity. All they needed was what was known as reasonable suspicion, something that you could point to, just a little bit of a fact, and you could stop someone and pat them down. And from there, the court was off to the races. Police have a discretion to arrest people for misdemeanor seatbelt violations, punishable only by a fine. Discretion to the police. Most often, police don't operate and execute that discretion, but they can. They have the discretion to search a car's compartment. They have discretion to impound a car after a stop. Someone runs away from the police on site, that's a basis for stopping, frisking them. A mistake of law. Police officer, Supreme Court case held a few years ago in North Carolina. Police officer thought that the law was a violation of traffic violations if they had one light out. So the officer stopped this car. Turned out he was wrong on the law. Actually, you couldn't stop someone unless you had two lanes. But he found drugs in the car. It didn't matter. This mistake of law, we're going to bend over backward. The police are going to be allowed to operate. A more disturbing case, in my view, just a year ago, the court held when police illegally stop a person. They have no basis for stopping the person. But then it turns out there is a warrant, an outstanding warrant, just for a traffic violation. Poof, it turns that stop into a legal one. And so think about what that means. And indeed, the lone dissenting voice of Justice Sonia Sotomayor pointed this out very much. It was in the midst of all the details of Ferguson coming out, that the police could, in fact, just simply choose to stop whomever they saw fit on the hope and chance that they would have an outstanding traffic violation, and then they could do anything they wanted within that car. Anything. Suddenly rendered it all legal. And perhaps most disturbing, what the court found in another opinion, was that the motivations of race, or really any motivations of the police officers, are of no consequence. Right? What that allows for is a pretextual arrest. Police can operate on a racist hunch, and they can stop a car in the hopes, right, that they've done something wrong. Or maybe they can even find something wrong. How many of you right now, let's be very creative here, you're legislators, right? What are some good traffic violations that you can perhaps think about right now? What could a police officer stop you for if you're driving a car? Yes?
Speeding.
Speeding, absolutely. Anyone else?
Running a light.
Sir, running a light.
Like what, tail light out?
Tail light out, potentially, right? If you're not in North Carolina. Yes?
Talking on a cell phone.
Talking on a cell phone.
Changing lanes without a turn signal.
Changing lane without a traffic signal, right? Professor Devin Carbato has an exhaustive list of every traffic violation you can think of. And there are ones I hadn't even known were violations, right? The point is, there are so many, and we probably all violate the law 10 times, 20 times a day. So if the police want to stop you, they can find a basis for it, right? Whether it's, again, some ticket you didn't pay, a failure to yield in a traffic area. Law professor Paul Butler describes, a former prosecutor describes a game he would go around with a police officer, his police officer's friend, and they would play, stop that car. Right? Pick a car, we're going to follow this car, we'll find a way to stop it. Again, allowing this sort of unbridled discretion to play out. And the effects of this sort of practice can, of course, escalate. Right? All police departments generally operate with a use of force continuum. And some of that sounds logical enough. You start with sort of more minor uses of force, rhetoric, words, and it escalates. But this sort of process, this unbridled discretion allows for this continuum to play out. And of course it allows for selective enforcement. And while we talk, and rightly we do, about the violent deaths of individuals, I want to focus on these more minor acts and how they escalate. People are humiliated by these experiences. They lose faith and trust in the police. And a majority of the Supreme Court doesn't seem to understand the consequences of their decisions, of their actions. And maybe it has to do a little bit with the composition of the court. In oral arguments a couple of years ago, and it was concerning how long a stop could be extended before a dog would come to search the car, Chief Justice John Roberts said, usually, people have told me that when you're stopped, the officer says license and registration. So think about that. The Chief Justice, the person who has the biggest role, arguably, in this country to craft law, would appear from this statement to have never been stopped. He is not, as Justice Sotomayor, who retorted to the chief and was known and is known for her empathy and decried by some for her empathy, said, "Chief, I've been stopped, and keeping me past giving me the ticket is annoying as heck, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 45. But these stops aren't, of course, just annoying. This sort of unbounded discretion can lead to increased uses of violence, and it focuses in a discriminatory and physical fashion. And police departments prioritize where they're going to focus their broken windows policing, where they're going to focus their unbridled discretion, and it invariably falls in areas of concentrated population, in poorer urban areas. And these police-citizen encounters increase the probability of excessive force, also with disproportionate racial impact. Blacks are more likely than whites to be kicked, pepper sprayed, or shot with a stun gun, more likely to be grabbed by police, more likely to be handcuffed, to have a gun pointed at them. And of course, before you can be shot, you must be stopped. Consider the case of Philando Castile and the dangerous set of cards that he was handed as a man of color and a target of police. Philando Castile was killed, you may recall, a couple of years ago outside of Minneapolis by a police officer. He was permitted, he had authorized use of a gun in his car. He informed the officer that he had a gun, and within a short and tragic 40 seconds, Mr. Castile was killed by the police officer. But the odds weren't always against Mr. Castile because, as came out later after his tragic death, it turned out that police in the Twin Cities area had pulled Castile over at least 52 times in the 13 years prior to his death. That's one time every 3 months for 13 years. And he'd been given citations for minor offenses, right? The ones we talked about. You can so easily stop and target: speeding, driving without a muffler, not wearing a seatbelt. He was charged over that time almost $7,000 in fines and fees, and yet the court dismissed the majority of his 86 violations. To be stopped by the police with that frequency is the danger. That's the threat. And it has to do in part because just as we have a very deferential standard with respect to stopping and seizing individuals, so too do we with the use of force test. The use of force test, which was from a case called Graham versus Connor, involves a few things. And it involves what sounds really great. We're going to determine, was the police officer's actions reasonable? All right, we can all agree with that standard. That sounds, on its face, eminently reasonable. But you look at the totality of the circumstances, again, a very legal term. You're supposed to look at the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others, and whether he's actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade by arrest. All sounds maybe reasonable enough in terms of 3 factors. But then the court, and it's this language that is repeated in opinion after opinion, explains you have to look at it from the perspective of a reasonable police officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision or hindsight. You have to understand that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. And finally, as part of its objective test, the court should not consider the officer's intent or motivation in assessing that reasonableness. You can't look at what the officer did prior to that very moment of use of force. So if the officer has unwisely or out of racist motivation chose to go up on a young 12-year-old and drive right up to them, and then feel when they take out their toy gun that they're threatened, it's eminently reasonable to shoot that 12-year-old boy. And these tests, imagine a lot of you have talked about implicit bias, taken maybe an implicit bias association test. These tests feed into biases that we know about because they promote a view that things are always fast, and they accept and indulge some of our most base and racist or prejudicial impulses. So tests have been taken of all sorts of members of the population, police and community otherwise. And when individuals are shown images, usually in video games, of either a white person with a gun or a black individual with a gun, people are more likely to target blacks than white targets. They're slower to press, don't shoot, when an unarmed suspect is black. And people are quicker to press shoot when an armed suspect is black. But the Graham v. Connor test, this test on use of force, encourages and allows for these prejudicial impulses because it's reasonable to make that assumption in that moment. That's what that law reifies, legitimates. And so finally, I think we had put up this slide a little bit earlier, but I want to get to the aspect of accountability, the lack of accountability, both criminal and civil. There are very few criminal prosecutions of police officers for excessive force. And when there is a prosecution, officers usually go free. And it's very much related to that Graham v. Connor test. Now, there are other explanations, perhaps. State criminal prosecutions of police officers for excessive force may be limited due to relationships between prosecutors and police. More often than not, there's no independent investigation. So the very office, right, that prosecutes crimes and needs to work with police officers has a natural incentive or disincentive, right, to prosecute police. You want good relations. Federal prosecutions have a much higher standard, in most cases, to result in prosecutions of officers. But let me explain how difficult it is and why maybe a prosecutor in good faith might elect not to try and prosecute an officer, or why a jury might acquit an officer. And it's related again to this Graham v. Connor standard. Again, sadly, I imagine anyone from their hometown or a decent-sized city can point to these. I want to talk about a case that involved two individuals, Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams out of Cleveland. This horrible case occurred about 3 years ago. Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams drove by two police one night at very high speed, and a loud bang. The officers alleged that they heard a loud bang, and they believed they had been shot at. Over the next 20 minutes, 62 police cars with over 100 officers joined in a chase of Timothy and Melissa. During the chase, which reached incredibly high speeds of over 120 miles per hour, officers repeatedly called over their radios that the driver and passenger had a gun, that they were loading their guns, that they were aiming their guns at them. As the car was essentially cornered in a middle school parking lot, the car was stopped. 12 officers fired at them. Officer Michael Brelo, pictured here, first fired 37 shots from near his car, and then jumped on the roof of their car and fired 15 more shots through the windshield. In total, 137 shots were fired. Russell and Williams were dead. They didn't have a gun. Prosecutors determined that 12 of the officers who had fired their weapons reasonably feared for their lives. They were all hearing gunshots. It was reasonable to believe that other officers, or that Mr. Williams and Russell were firing their weapons. Michael Brelo was the only one charged with manslaughter, and he was not found guilty of the death. The court found that his shooting And the reason they couldn't was because they couldn't determine which bullets were responsible for killing him. So by virtue of other police's needless shooting, he couldn't be found guilty of manslaughter. And for the 15 shots from the roof of the car into the window, he was also charged with assault. But the court found, and it was just a court, by the way, the police officer did not want to have a jury of his peers in this matter, so he had the option of only having a judge rule on his case, that the gunshots made it reasonably believed, too, that the suspects had guns and were shooting. And thus it's that the errors of police, their own violence and aggression, that actually exonerates them. Now the area that I'm more familiar with is actually the civil rights lawsuit area, where you try and hold police officers responsible civilly. And this is the primary means of holding police officers responsible under the law. This is how we develop, such as it is, a body of law that holds police accountable and says what's permitted and what isn't. But we don't see so many successful lawsuits, relatively speaking. Only 1% of people who believe the police used improper force against them ever file a lawsuit. There's a lot of reasons that can be attributed to that. Many times people's interactions with the police were as suspects or defendants, so they're not so inclined to go after the police. In some cases, they're unaware of their rights, maybe due to poverty, fear of police reprisals, or the burdens of incarceration. It's harder to sue when you're in prison. There are limits on what is known as standing. If you want to try and stop certain police practices, it's very difficult to do so. And it's hard to get a lawyer to bring your case unless the facts are really bad. Right? A police officer is going to say, well, how bad were your injuries? Dignity? It's not going to be worth so much. And so that lawyer might not want to take the case. And so generally, only the most egregious cases are litigated. And so it is these countless thousands and thousands of interactions that aren't litigated. But the biggest way that police officers are insulated from liability, that police departments and cities are insulated from liability, are through what's known as qualified immunity, and also through very high municipal liability standards. Back for a moment, the 14th Amendment, right? This was passed in the midst of Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. There was a recognition that all was not equal. And during Reconstruction, you saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. You saw the rise of mob violence. And you saw Southern police leaders and officers often doing nothing. And so, as an adjunct to the 14th Amendment, the Congress passed what was known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1871. That is what sometimes now you'll hear about Section 1983. Any civil rights lawsuit filed in federal court is pursuant to this Ku Klux Klan Act. Think of this connection to our history. And we can see, right, marches in Charlottesville and elsewhere, right? This is a connection. Civil rights lawsuits were aimed to deter racist violence. That was the origin. And sadly, there's still a need to ensure that. And for a little while during Reconstruction, these laws were enforced. There were criminal prosecutions. There were civil lawsuits brought under this act. But then you saw a retrenchment for many years. And then it was brought back in the 1960s, so there was a means to sue. But then the court wasn't so happy about this churn, right? Worried about how this would affect police, how it would affect morale, whether it would deter zealous policing, whether it would bankrupt police officers. And so there needed to be a new standard. And so in order to hold the police officer responsible, you needed to show, and recall how difficult those legal standards were, you needed to show that the action was unconstitutional. But you also had to show that it was clearly established that it was unconstitutional. Right? This meant it had to be so obvious that it was wrong that only a plainly incompetent, and these are the words of the court, only a plainly incompetent officer would have committed that act of excessive force. Needless to say, this insulates police in a lot of situations. And let me illustrate with just yet one more case from the Supreme Court just a couple of years ago. This case is known as Mullenix versus Luna, and it involves an individual named Israel Leha Jr. Texas police officers had received reports that an officer was in pursuit of Mr. Leha, who was threatening to shoot officers and was possibly intoxicated. Again, another high-speed chase. Anticipating the route of the chase, officers had set up spikes along this way, so that when Mr. Leha came along, that should puncture his tires, perhaps cause him to flip over, but deter him from going any further and not escaping. But Texas trooper Chadron Mullenix had a different idea. He got up on this bridge, and he decided he would use his rifle to shoot the car's engine block once Leha came into his sights. And despite being told by his supervisor not to shoot, Mullenix fired all 6 shots, hitting Leha 4 times and killing him. The Supreme Court didn't really address the constitutional question. It simply said, there's no law that squarely governs this situation. And it noted, again, that Graham test. Look, Leha was an immediate threat. He was only moments away and speeding towards a confrontation with officers he had threatened to kill. How could the officer have known any better? Well, let's think about the facts. The officers had, of course, intentionally stationed themselves in the way of Leha to stop him. So the threat is a questionable or is a selective one. Moreover, in terms of there being any quick speed or necessity, Mullenix had enough time to plan to shoot and discuss his idea with fellow officers and ultimately disregard his superior's order. And of course, we don't even look at motivation. And what's astounding there is, it turned out that Officer Mullenix had been known not to be showing enough initiative as a police officer. And so after shooting Mr. Leha those 6 times, he said to his supervisor, "Was that proactive enough for you?" Right? So the motivations there were not necessarily about purely good policing, but showing his mettle, his toughness as an officer. The officer was held immune. I find looking at these cases, these stories, these tragic details, that the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates are quite prescient and apt here in terms of describing that police departments do indeed have an incredible amount of power over people's bodies. And they will not be held responsible, even if it's an overreaction, even if it comes from misunderstanding, and even in many cases, if it emanates from a policy. So what to do? I mean, part of what I take some comfort in is, in fact, that we are talking about these issues. That can sometimes seem a little trite, but the reality is these events aren't new. But it is because of activism, it is because of cell phone cameras that we know. And there are efforts underfoot to change policies and practices. There are, just so you understand, police practices are so localized. They're very similar, but there's 18,000 police departments in the United States. And so there are incredible ways to change them. There are also some good practices going on, and these departments need to learn from one another. They need to learn to de-escalate, right? To not use all of that unfettered discretion. They need to adopt many of these reforms. Look, you can join the San Francisco Police Department. And there are efforts and attempts to reform. San Francisco Police Department has changed their policy. They used to have a policy where you could shoot a fleeing car. The law allows for that. But San Francisco Police Department, to their credit, has elected not to do so. Now, I will say, the leading San Francisco Police Department union opposes that decision. But I believe lives are saved as a result of that. In addition to de-escalation, we need more prosecutors of color. This is astounding. 95% of elected prosecutors throughout the country are white. Just 1% of elected prosecutors in this entire country are minority women. Right? So think who is holding the power. The composition of the Supreme Court matters. Right? Justice Sotomayor has been championed for her empathy. She's the only member of the court who's ever really had any trial court experience. She was a prosecutor in New York City. She was a trial judge. These others who sit there, were generally appellate judges who don't know the day-to-day, who haven't been stopped by the police. There need to be countless other changes in the law that I'm happy to discuss, both with Professor McGee and with all of you. But I just want to close on the note that police brutality, we have to see, undermines the legitimacy of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And so we owe it to police, we owe it to our communities, we owe it to our country to try and fix and reclaim that promise that was just hinted at after Reconstruction. Thank you very much.
So before we move to the final component of the program, a Q&A with all of you, we're going to have a brief conversation between Avi and Rhonda McGee, a member of the USF Law School faculty. Professor McGee is a teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction interventions for lawyers and law students and works on minimizing social identity-based bias. A full-time faculty member at USF since 1998, a full professor since 2004, she's been named Dean's Circle Research Scholar, served as co-director of the University Center for Teaching Excellence, and co-facilitator of the Ignatian Faculty Forum Faculty Development Program. She teaches torts, race law and policy, and courses in contemplative and mindful law and law practice. She's trained and a highly practiced facilitator with an emphasis on mindful communication, trained through programs at the University of Massachusetts School of Medicine's OASIS Teacher Training Institute and the Stanford Graduate School of Business Facilitator Training Program. In April 2015, she was named a Fellow of the Mind and Life Institute. Please join me for Avi returning and Professor McGee coming up on stage. So we'll have about 15-20 minutes of a discussion between them, and then we'll have time for Q&A with all of you.
So thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you, Avi, for that presentation, and thanks to all of you for being here. I do want to take the prerogative of being a law professor who also engages in mindfulness and teaches mindfulness and compassion practices to just invite a kind of pause with what we just heard. Because I will say for myself, Avi, just listening to that presentation was in and of itself just shy of traumatizing. Very, very, very hard to hear. How many of you in this room found it difficult to hear what was just presented? Yeah? So if we can take a moment to just really check in and notice what is alive in you right now, because we really do want this to be a conversation that includes your voices. But we really want it to be a deep conversation, one that's coming from the truth that you know in your body, in your bones, about what Avi was talking about, how all of our communities are impacted by it, how this isn't other people's issues really. These issues are really affecting all of us, not in the same ways. So if we can just pause, sense into, again, what do you know already about the underlying dynamics that drive this system? What's driving this? Because if we're ever going to transform it, and I'm going to use that word as opposed to reform. I'm going to be highly aspirational. We got to change this. If we're ever going to do it, we're going to need real talk, courage, courage, courage from the heart. A kind of public-facing love, I'll call it. We gotta give a damn about each other in a way that we sort of haven't. Because we couldn't have this if we really cared about each other. So again, just pause, allow the truth of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you know to arise. And be a kind of deep ground for whatever you share, your comments, your questions. A deep ground, a deep ground, a deep ground. I teach courses dealing with race and law, and have for almost 20 years, right across the street. And looking closely at how it is that the law has played a role in constructing a society where inequality is very real, and at the same time been turned toward again and again and again by those of us who would seek to break the chains of oppression, right? So this kind of dual role of law, perpetrator of oppression and also where we turn to is for some hope is what I sit with. I sit with law students in small seminars where we look at how it is that the legal system has, since the founding, been, I would say, guilty of making race relevant, constructing the ideas that we have that we're racially different and separate, seeing it in the lives of Native American people. Right, started Johnson versus McIntosh, the famous case that rationalized the taking of the property from Native Americans like the Ohlone, who consecrated and lived in this space before we were here. Right, so we look in the classes that I teach across differently racialized groups, not only African Americans, but how did Native American dispossession get rationalized under the law? How did Asian American othering become just a consistent theme of American history from the early days of Asian American migration and immigration to this country, Asian exclusion laws, immigration laws, etc. Of course, with slavery, of course, with the taking of this land from the Mexican American people, right, the conquest. So there are, and then up through, right, so through 17th and 18th and 19th centuries up through the 20th to today. This is long and deep history of racialized oppression in this society. And so when we look at what's happening in the particular spaces where we see criminal injustice, over-policing, police violence, and the law that kind of maintains all of that, it is built upon a long and deep history that we don't sit with enough, we don't talk about it enough, we don't teach it very openly. So when I hear you, my heart is heavy. I should say I was born and raised in North Carolina and Virginia, so in the South. I went to school at the University of Virginia forever, I say, undergraduate, master's degree, law degree in Charlottesville. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't know what is happening in Charlottesville? Is happening, I say, because although in August we saw that demonstration, the KKK and other white nationalists, other white supremacists descending upon Charlottesville, they've stayed. It wasn't just that incident. They were back again a couple of weeks ago, beat up a black man in Charlottesville, who then later got charged. He was the victim of the assault under some quirky, crazy Virginia law. He ended up being charged, the black man. People are still scratching their heads trying to figure out how that happened, but it happened. So think particularly about the issues you raised and how it is that our legal system immunizes police, justifies police violence, makes it really, really hard to bring a lawsuit, demoralizes people from even trying. I can't not hear the history of that. Like I can't, it's, right? Am I the only one who understands that what we're talking about and hearing about is grounded in a very, very deep, under-acknowledged, unredeemed history? It's been so caught up in saying, well, we didn't do that, that was the past, right? Whatever my ancestors and forefathers did, that wasn't me. I'm not responsible. It's an unredeemed history. So I really look at what is happening here and ask these kinds of hard questions about how do we not just reform but transform the system. And I know I'm not alone in this. I'm sure in your most aspirational moments, you might think about these things, but I'll say, you know, Michelle Alexander, the author of the book that many of you probably are familiar with, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. If you haven't read that book and you're interested in these issues, you probably will want to. But her book was profound and beautiful and impactful. And there have been many profound and beautiful and impactful books and writings such as yours that people are, you read, you learn these things that you never believed would be happening in America, and they're happening, and they keep happening. And another book is written. There's a book recently out called Chokehold by law professor Paul Butler. There's a new book by Matt Taibbi out, really describing what happened to Eric Garner, who died of a chokehold in New York City. Right? Paul Butler's book is really, and I have to say I haven't finished reading it, but from what I've read so far, he's really trying to get us to see that these are not isolated incidents, that there is a pattern, and that the system isn't really broken. It's working just as it was kind of intended to keep certain populations really rendered non-entities, non-effective in this society. And so when you have one or two break out, let's say a Barack and a Michelle Obama, all hell breaks out in response. Because the system is not meant to allow for that. And you all know what I'm talking about. In response to the ascension and the successful presidency of Barack Obama, the successful First Lady reign of Michelle Obama, everything that has happened in response is not unrelated to this particular topic that we're focused on. And this is all very painful to sort of look at. Michelle Alexander, in her book, again, beautifully detailed how in the days following the ending of post-civil rights movement, we call it the Second Reconstruction in the 60s, when there were opportunities now for some kind of transformation and new opportunities such that people like me could be here, as opposed to being more or less in a sharecropper house cleaner role in North Carolina, which was the role that my grandmother had played in North Carolina up through the years of my birth. She was basically doing the work that would have been relegated to her in a slave society up through the early 60s, mid-70s. My own parents were barely able to complete high school, systematically rendered unable to really compete. So comes the civil rights movement, opportunities are opened up for people like me to actually go to college, to actually prove my capacity to compete, identify me as gifted and worthy in the ways that our society will do for a small select group of people. And yet, fast forward to today, kind of a backlash against all of the policies, all of the struggle that maybe your parents and some of you in this room helped to create, all of the change that helped to make it possible for the two of us to be here. Such a backlash against us. And I think Paul Butler, Michelle Alexander, other authors who are looking at the criminal justice system see the role of the criminal justice system as pretty crucial and central to the efforts to, in a colorblind way, at least on his face, maintain this system of subordination of people of color. And so I think it's very interesting to me that Michelle Alexander has actually left law. She might be back, but she left law with put a period on the fact that she was leaving being a law professor a few years ago. Where did she go? Anybody know? What's that?
LA.
Well, she went to seminary. She went to seminary. She left law so she could get engaged with these deeper questions. So I'm staying in law, but insisting that we need to have kind of a deeper, kind of spiritual conversation, a conversation that might touch hearts and minds in a different way. Paul Butler, in his book Chokehold, also says we need more than reform, we need transformation. So these times call for a discourse that does ground itself in the beautiful, detailed research and analysis that we were just privileged to hear. But doesn't stop there, because we can analyze to death, people can hear these statistics. Jennifer Eberhardt, a kind of genius award-winning African-American social psychologist based in Stanford, has done a lot of research to show how the mind works and how unconscious bias works on us. So, for example, research showing that when people hear statistics about disproportionality of crime against African Americans, some part of a good percentage of whites gets more conservative when they hear those statistics. Even people who don't believe themselves to be biased suddenly are less open. And what is that? What is that? What is that? That is what I think we need to figure out. Because there's some kind of way in which this problem is bigger than our rationale. It has to get us thinking about who we are in a fundamental way and who we are together in a way that our forefathers didn't conceive of, really fought against us seeing. Right? So this is what I think, this is what I hope our conversation will, at least in some ways, comprehend. Your questions will give us something.
Yeah, no, I'll absolutely, just your words were beautiful and illuminating as well. They got me to think, we're giving quite a promotion for Paul Butler, because I'm going to say, so in Chokehold, he talks a lot also about just, of course, how pervasive it is in our culture. So in some sense, what we see in policing, what we see in the law is a reflection of culture, and he talks quite movingly of the dehumanization, particularly focuses on men of color, and of course from slavery. And then he notes, very famously, the film King Kong has been decried as really, right, a violent image of the black man, of the threat, and he quite cogently sort of brings you through history and shows even, I don't know what magazine it is, but an image of LeBron James holding, I apologize, I forget the name of the actress, but a young white actress, and then it's sort of, in essence, he characterized it as a recreation of the King Kong image. And that some of these things, seem on their face fairly benign. It's a magazine, it's promoting this incredibly successful basketball player, and yet in a subtle manner, it continues this pervasive idea and thinking. And so I think the law is a reflection of that. I know we were speaking a little bit before, and discussing also how I think some of these legal practices, they do redound, even if they originate in sometimes some very, I think, what is clearly racist places, they end up affecting all of us. In the sense, of course, in which we are all, and need to be, at least in a very transformative and integrated sense, all one community, one people. But also the practices that are applied, perhaps, in one poor, high-rise, low-income area will ultimately play out in other areas, and they do spread. And so what might first seem to be something, oh, it's just happening to those people, the police are just doing that, will be employed, will be played out throughout, and we will all be feeling those horrible effects of a police state.
Can you say a little bit more about how whites are implicated in this? In other words, I don't mean to suggest only about bias, but the different ways that living with this structures white experience as well. Is this a question that makes some sense? Because when we talk about this, as often we're saying, black people, people of color, here are the statistics. How are these realities constructing white experience, opportunity, blindness, what's going on with whites when all of this is happening? This is a part of the question that comes, this is a question that comes up for me. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and others.
Yeah, yeah. I think certainly at least one, and thinking about the Jennifer Everhart's studies, is of course, it solidifies, I think, in people's view. There are certain people who are criminals, there are certain people who are law-abiding. And of course, there are statistics out there that reflect that actually society is pretty equally law-abiding and law-breaking across all races and ethnicities. But it reinforces an idea, it reinforces an image. If you drive through a low-income, poor neighborhood, you are going to see a larger police presence, which may even be there ostensibly, or at least in some departments, some notion of we want to stop crime. But again, there is a selective enforcement. Again, I'm going to quote Butler. It talks about, look, if you were, because it's less an issue in California now, but if in certain police departments, certain jurisdictions, if you wanted to criminalize marijuana, you know, you sort of go, well, you want to get a lot of people arrested for marijuana, you should go to a college campus, right? That's the best place to arrest a lot of people for pot. But that's not what police do, right? They go, as he noted sort of historically, they would go to the low-income, poorer areas and arrest people for that. And I think so it reinforces that image, that idea, which I think is pernicious and wrong, and one that people live by, can be self-congratulatory, and delude themselves.
So it has that social psychological impact that sort of helps maintain bias. But it also has, I think, material implications, clear,
Sure.
quite clear, right? So if a certain population is overburdened, actually and psychologically, with the, and spiritual, the consequences of constantly being targeted and constantly being made to feel less valued by the society, literally more vulnerable in a way that we can just hear the statistics and just keep going. Then it can, as we are struggling with just trying to maintain and feel whole and healthy, often taking out our frustrations on each other, it can leave greater opportunities for whites generally. I'm reminded that a gender theorist was recently talking about the spate of sex harassment lawsuits that we're all kind of paying attention to. So to intersect a little bit with the gender issues that we're also dealing with in terms of ongoing cultural pressure. An observation was made that we often talk about the number of women who are assaulted, right? The number of women who suffered from some sort of harassment. We don't talk about white male or male experience, let's say, as being constructed by that as well. So men are, on the one hand, perpetrating, and we're not naming that. We're saying women are being assaulted as if it's just happening. But on the other hand, their lives are materially benefited by the fact that women are somehow cowed out of different industries, deciding to not pursue opportunities because they don't want to be victimized in those ways. So I think that reverse, that recognizing that whenever we are talking about one dimension of experience, we're always implicitly also inviting ourselves to think about what's happening on the reverse, and how is that, again, all part of what we're swimming in? Our inability to name that there is not only oppression that pushes people down, that oppression has a kind of a balancing effect for people who are not being targeted. I'll say I was actually happened to be presenting along with at a conference with Van Jones a couple weeks ago. And one of the things he mentioned was when he was a law student at Yale, there was a lot of cocaine and drug use at Yale. And yet, instead of going to Yale to kind of look for perpetrators, they were going around the corners of the black community and constantly over-policing there. We all have stories from which we know that drug use, for example, is pervasive. And yet again, the way we police targets and makes some people more vulnerable. So that does, in fact, have the consequence of both oppressing one side, but really making some others freer. And that, I think, is what we need to reckon with. We have to somehow get whites and others who are not as persecuted under the current system, really, to get in a conversation about how we all become more courageous about disrupting the system. And so I know we want to open it up to Q&A as well. I don't know whether we're on time.
So we have about 20 minutes. Why don't, if someone has a question, and then we'll bring the mic back.
Anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? Yeah. Professor McBride.
Hi, thank you both. My name is Keely McBride, and I am a political theorist here. And this conversation made me, I was reading Tocqueville this afternoon, and there was this beautiful quote from him where he talked about the particular power that operates in modern democracies, and what he says is it's really soft and not coercive, and so it kind of lures us into normalizing it and not seeing it. And what he said, though, was, but when it does have to operate really brutally, it always operates on a very select group of people, right? And of course, Tocqueville was very aware of the racial dynamics of American politics. But so I had to think about that in terms of the really differentiated relationships with power and how particular forms of power are invisible to different people. But I actually have a much more concrete question for you, which is more and more people, I live in Oakland, I hear a lot about police abolition. And it seems to me you could take your talk and your response and say, see, this shows we just have to eliminate the police. And so have you guys gotten to that point where you endorse police abolition?
It's funny, before you asked your question, I was thinking of trying to throw in one more thing, and I guess in some ways I'll make this somewhat of a response. I don't think I have. And in part, I think one of the tragic aspects of where we are and how racialized it is that I think for many people of color, particularly poor people of color, but I think for people of color, the idea that they cannot like the police, that they cannot want to call the police, that they cannot feel positively about the police is the real, is a real tragedy. I represented a boy once in Newark who he wanted to be a police officer growing up until the reason I represented him. Just an absolute, outright racial profiling instance where they threw him on the ground, swore at him and treated him violently and told him he had no fucking rights and he was lucky because he had done nothing. Needless to say, he never wanted to be a police officer after that. He'd been deprived of that. I don't know. I think there's enough in our society, sadly, that we do need protection. There is criminality, and so I don't know that I've given up on police as a whole. I do think there needs to be not just radical reform, but as Rhonda says, transformation. But I will grant you that as I work within the system very much, I recognize that we need to work without. So I haven't gotten there yet, but I can have great sympathy for that need.
Oh, Keely, I don't know. I would say that, again, it's very hard for me at this point to isolate out policing from the rest of the whole society that's a little bit crazy, right? So when we talk about do we do away with police, it's hold everything else constant. It feels like one of the things we're dealing with, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and others have pointed this out, is that we now turn to the police for absolutely every darn thing, right? We are not investing in our education system, and therefore when people are truants or not feeling inspired to go to school, that's okay, we'll send the cops after. Mental health problems. We're not investing in making sure that there's adequate mental health services for all. That's okay, we'll send the cops after. It is absolutely incredible how much we are putting in the purview of sort of policing because of the ways that our communities are just not richly supporting people in distress. And so the police are finding themselves called in. Schools, public schools are being over-policed, right? We were talking about a story that I learned just a few weeks ago about a young African-American gifted child in Richmond, Virginia, who found himself about to be handcuffed and prosecuted for assault after a friend of his, white male friend, this is an African-American child, white male friend just kind of grabbed him and they're playing a game of, who laughs first. The person who laughs first is the one who loses. And the kid, his friend, grabs him by the shoulders and is throwing him around. my African-American young friend, he's 13 now, he was 11 when this happened, Elijah. He happens to just throw his elbow inadvertently into his friend's belly. He immediately realizes he might have heard of it, so he turns around and tries to help him. Kid is okay in the school. What happens the very next day? Cops show up at the school. Apparently the young man, his friend, has gone home and told his parents what happened to him that day. And the police have showed up to his 5th grade class to arrest him. Again, he is one of 2 gifted kids, African American kids in the school for the gifted. That's a whole other resegregation problem that we could talk about. It shouldn't be that way. But so here he was in this situation of some kind of skewed demographics that are not good for anybody's education. But he's doing the best he can. And suddenly the police are about to put him on that school to prison pipeline that we've been talking about. The good news of this is he is this beautiful gifted child who ends up going to city council and getting policy change so that cops are not going into school and arresting 5th graders in Richmond and Henrico County, Virginia anymore. But it's happening all over the country. It happens in Florida. There's a kindergarten, you can look it up on YouTube, who was arrested, handcuffed, girl, African American girl, because she was having a bad day in kindergarten. And what does that lead to? So I think the police have been, the role that police are playing in our societies, in our communities, especially the communities that are not privileged, right? And I live in a fairly privileged San Francisco community, so I'm not as victimized as I know my brothers and sisters who are poor are more vulnerable. Police are coming in and really not playing a very good role, but it's probably, again, because the rest of our society has given up on so many of us. So it's hard for me to answer the question of should we abolish policing. I think we need to reinvigorate common humanity, the common good, the sense that we are really all in this together. Democracy doesn't work otherwise, and we have to take care of the least of these, to use some Jesuit language here. I mean, if we don't do that, just targeting the police, I think we're gonna find ourselves still suffering the same kinds of ills.
Any other questions?
So I was wondering, why, when these racial, police brutality situations tend to escalate, is it so often at traffic stops, routine traffic stops? Why that instance specifically does it become so much more dangerous for people of color?
I think it begins with the stop. I focused on the car because I think so often that's where more obvious infractions occur, but it happens in pedestrian stops as well. But it's in that confrontation that I think everything is so fraught, and where you have a situation that escalates. To the extent that police are stopping someone, right, they have some sort of objective in mind. So they believe, or at the very least under some pretext, I believe the individual has done something wrong. And so they are ready to take away someone's liberty. And I think, and what we have seen at least, is that for a while now, it's been well documented, police have been taught and trained with sort of what is known as a warrior mindset. Really speaks to a mindfulness. If you want to take a sort of fascinating detour to promote YouTube again, look at police recruitment videos. Go home and do something. And I think if it's still the one in Inglewood, California, it looks like a horrible, violent video game. And so what are you telling the officers if you're going to come there, right? And there are, thankfully, other departments that are promoting and recruiting and trying to employ de-escalation techniques and what has been and sometimes debated a better form of community policing. But that warrior mindset teaches your first job as a police officer is to come home alive, right? It's that you're going into a war zone. It's like that sign in that police precinct that I mentioned in Cleveland. And I think if they begin with that mindset, that they're about to stop someone, and they are on edge, and they believe that that person is a threat to them, they begin with that presumption, it's not a surprise that it leads to this violence. And then you look at these studies of bias and prejudices that people bring to those encounters. And then, is there often, in some cases, people will question the suspect and then the victim's reaction? Do individuals overreact to a police officer? Yes, to be sure they do, but understandably. Lucky in my life for a variety of factors, not the least of which is my race and my wealth, have not been stopped by the police that much. But I'm tense when I'm stopped by the police. I'm resentful. I'm angry, particularly if I believe I haven't done anything wrong. I'm scared. I experience all of these things. I can't imagine if I've been stopped 52 times and treated disrespectfully, and I can see the veins pulsing on that officer. So it begins with that encounter. I think it is all the things that Rhonda related to. So it's that encounter, and that encounter is just so dangerous. The idea that there are kids who are taught, there's been a lot of talk now, people call it the Ferguson effect. So some people have suggested, certain advocates of police have suggested that all of this attention, the cell phone videos and all this stuff, is really bad and is deterring police from doing their job. Right? They're scared about bad publicity. So it's leading to, the statistics are debated, but it's led to an increase in violence and in crime. So even if we accept that, right, but there's, I think, a very fascinating alternative explanation that a scholar has come up with, which is actually the people of these poor urban communities who have been oppressed by the police, and admittedly, based on seeing much of this news, are scared to call the police. The idea that that is the consequence of this, and so, to the question about whether we should abolish the police, that's also a tragedy, right? That to the extent you feel threatened by someone who is a criminal, that you won't call the police because of what the police will do to them, will do to you, is an abomination in our society.
And just to add a little, there's a gendered thing going on as well. Devin Carbato, and he was also mentioned before, law professor from UCLA, has written, and others have, about some of the particular gender dynamics that show up, especially if it's African American male and male of any other race, or even another African American male. All kinds of notions are brought into that encounter that have to do with a broader crisis in masculinity, which is part of why the police are acting the way they're acting anyway. And we all know, again, the sex harassment and sex assault rise in consciousness is helping some people realize there's a broader crisis in terms of how men are living and constructing their own identities. That's also part of this. And there's, again, and that doesn't happen in isolation of race and culture and privilege, right? So everybody's particular way of being constructed as a man in society is in there. And when those two constructions come together, it's highly vulnerable. It's a highly volatile, potentially volatile situation. And so that's true when it's male on male, but male on female. So there's a lot going on in each of these encounters that is part of why they become violent, may become violent so quickly. But the training part and the fact that police are tending to be trained through the broken windows theory to just, as a quota matter, just arrest a numbers of people and then target certain communities to get those numbers. And then, feel supported that they can keep going after the same kinds of people because they need the numbers. This means that no matter what your racial background, you're brought into that system, you're gonna be now part of that system. So just diversifying cops isn't going to make a difference, although it matters to some degree to have women and people of color on all sides of the badges, as well in the system of prosecution and adjudication. We do need people from all different backgrounds. But a lot of evidence shows that the mere fact you have diversification doesn't mean you have a different viewpoint. You really have to really work at the viewpoint and the embedded cultural dynamics if you want to change things.
Maybe one final question? Split between the student and the program.
Two questions?
So we'll do two questions.
So I just kind of want to play devil's advocate here, and often when we talk about issues of police brutality, people bring up civilian homicide rates. So, what's the best way to talk about the distinction between state-sanctioned violence and civilian?
You mean black on black crime in particular?
Right, black on black crime. white on white crime, whatever you want to call it, white people kill about the same number as black people kill in their own communities. Statistically based on, yeah, statistically it's about the same across the board. But I keep wondering where this like 6,000 number comes from. Anytime I'm in a conversation with somebody who is a dissenter to this issue, it's 6,000 black on black. The homicide rate for black people is 6,000 black people. I'm like, where does that number come from? Like, I don't get it.
And the other one, we'll merge them.
My question is, given that we need to go deeper, as Rhonda has said several times, and that you're trained in mindfulness and compassion resources, are you aware of any trainings or resources that are going to police departments and doing this work? And how could some of us get involved in that?
I'll start with the first one. I'm not aware of specifically the 6,000 number you're referring to. I do think, in some ways, I think in your question, it sounds like you actually have a very good answer too, which is I do think always the distinction of state-sanctioned violence versus civilian on civilian violence is of paramount importance. That our country, that our government of laws, not of men, as the rhetoric goes, that demands equal protection to people, that insists on due process before liberty and life can be taken away from someone. They are not comparable. No one, I mean, when we talk about excessive force, that's the death penalty, right? I mean, where I come from in terms of my adamant opposition to the death penalty is that I don't believe that we are perfect. And there may be other reasons for my opposition, but that is certainly one of them, right? That we are not perfect, we are not infallible, we can kill an innocent person. And so it is that same notion that state-sanctioned violence can be employed and do it in such an inexpertly and unjustifiable fashion is not defensible under any circumstances. And so regardless of the statistics that can be shown of violent propensities or higher crime rates, it doesn't justify them. I think where I recognize the conversation will arise is, where are your priorities? Sometimes it'll be, well, more deaths, maybe, right? I guess I've heard this argument, is coming from within this community. So you should look inward, right? Don't blame the police. Don't besmirch the police. And absolutely, I mean, we do. We need to stop violence. The senselessness that you describe everywhere. We do need to. My abolition might begin with the Second Amendment, but that's my own sentiment. But again, I think when you're talking about state-sanctioned violence, it is of a different piece and cannot be tolerated. And that is, while it is a criminal act first and foremost against those people, when we talk about an act of criminality, it is the state that should be prosecuting it because it is viewed as a crime against all of us. The death, between one civilian and another is a tragedy, but I don't believe it calls on the same collective will and denunciation.
I would totally agree with that. I think, again, it's rule of law question versus sort of community tragedy question. How invested are we in this idea that we are a nation of laws, not of men, and what does that mean for those who are sanctioned to use violence with immunity and with full force and support of the government? So we really have to realize those are false equivalencies that people are bringing. Yes, you've got 2 dead bodies, but to have a person be murdered or killed unjustifiably by the state is a particular kind of moral wrong. It is a moral wrong that makes us all more vulnerable. It renders our protestations of having a higher system than others, other governments, null and void. It really just opens us up to a kind of degradation of the entire system that is supposed to be there to kind of enfold everything else and respond, yes, to the community violence. If we're having the state officials actually exercise unjustifiable violence, then where do you turn when you need help with the community violence? So you have to have a sense of the prioritization, the sense of like that being a kind of singular kind of wrong that we all need to make sure doesn't happen, even as we try to work on the other kinds of violence that we're all suffering or maybe vulnerable to. And just on this question, I'll just say that, yes, I'm actually part of an organization called Transforming Justice, where we have trained judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, police, in practices of mindfulness that are about creating the capacity to see a bit more and to create a pause between reaction and response so that some other alternative, de-escalation or asking for the kinds of support you need to do your job well, and if that means as an officer, time off when you're actually overwhelmed and mental health service as an officer. So there are many of us in law who actually are working to deliver services and to create a conversation between police and community that is infused with a kind of a sense that we really are suffering together. You can look up this organization, transformingjustice.org, if you're reminded to contribute anything, you need some funds. But the bottom line is we're really trying. And we brought together members, all, for example, we all met at a gathering where you had wardens in the prison system. You had people who were convicts, and you had prosecutors. You had people representing every aspect of the criminal justice system sitting together and talking about what is wrong without pointing fingers, in a situation where we felt safe to just say, we're trying to figure this, what's wrong with this system out, figure that out. And so that's, our organization tries to create spaces where people can come together without agendas really, but first to sort of look clearly at the problem together, as opposed to looking at it from opposite sides, and from there to try to figure out how to respond. So people in the prison system actually stealthily bringing compassion practices inside the prisons, training their own wardens in human dignity and respect for prisoners. So it's slow work. I say to do this kind of work is to have a vision of a responsibility tied to the past and a commitment to carrying the fruits of which we won't see. This is long-term work. We have to change and transform. It means we are not going to live necessarily to see it. Hopefully you will, your children will. But the commitment has to be about changing who we are and how we respond to those who do harm, how we care, right, in a way that goes beyond our traditional circles of concern and keeps expanding and keeps expanding. That, I think, is our only hope. And I think the problems are dire enough, not just criminal justice. We got existential threats, nuclear war, climate change. If we can't figure out how to re-knit the bonds of human connection and kindness, actually, I'm sorry to say, I don't think we're going to be on this planet working on this very long. So I think it's urgent enough that we have to be thinking about new ways, and I appreciate the question.
Thank you both.
Thank you.